Hello, everybody. It's Michael Hollands once again for Sound of the Movies. Today, I have the pleasure to be joined by the legendary Walter Murch. On today's episode, we will talk about his extraordinary career. It is my great pleasure to welcome Walter Murch.
Thank you.
It's so great to have you on my show, and thank you very much for taking the time out of your schedule. As I understand, you started working and experimenting with sounds and recordings at a very early stage in your life. So I guess it was kind of evident for you right away that you would pursue a career in motion pictures.
No, not at all. I did start very early. I started playing around with tape recorders in 1952 when I was 9 years old, and but I thought of it just as my own private uh, hobby, like building model airplanes or something. My family had nothing to do with cinema, and I went to movies as a kid, but I wasn't obsessed with them. In my mid-teenage years, I stopped being obsessed with sound, and I thought, well, now I have to figure out what I'm going to do with the rest of my life. And I thought I would be maybe an architect or maybe an oceanographer. I don't know. I pursued many ideas, and then I wound up studying Romance languages at the Sorbonne in 1963, which was the height of Godard, Truffaut, and the New Wave. And I got interested in cinema and found out that there were film schools and applied and got accepted as a graduate student in film, luckily with a scholarship because I couldn't have afforded it otherwise. And that's when I put together my teenage obsession with sound and cinema. And you can think of the soundtrack of a film as being an extended symphony of musique concrète, which was one of the big influences on me in my teenage years. So those two things came together finally.
Great. Thank you, Walter. And you've had a great career. You've been in this business for 50 years. You have won 3 Academy Awards. You have been nominated 9 times, 6 nominations for editing, and 3 for sound mixing. And Roger Ebert once called you the most respected film editor and sound designer of modern cinema. I would like to pick your brain just a little because to me, film is about art. It's an art form. And how do you get most out of a movie? How do you explain or verbalize the art of film editing and sound?
It is really an art of arts. It's a meta art because it incorporates many different strands, which are each arts unto themselves. It is painting, which is to say photography. It is dramaturgy, which is acting. It is set design, which is a kind of sculpture. You can go on and on. The one new element in cinema is this idea of taking images that exist in time and splicing them together into one continuous ribbon of events, both in terms of images and sounds that accompany that. You try as much as possible to make the film operate on all these different wavelengths and then to coordinate them. And this is the job of ultimately of the director, to coordinate them all just in the same way that a composer of a symphony and a conductor takes all of the individual instruments in the orchestra in counterpoint with each other and makes them coalesce into a single developed whole that can exist over a 60 or 90 minute length of the symphony. So the thing about film that is unique is that it is a theater of thought in the sense that it's the first time in any art that we have been able to watch thoughts pass across the faces of actors, of characters,
Mm-hmm.
as those thoughts develop and interchange. And those thoughts are most interesting when they are at slight variance with what the people are saying. And they're even more interesting when they're slightly different than what the people are doing. So the simple line, I love you, is less interesting if the person says, I love you with a lovely smiling face and with body languages that embraces that. But it's more interesting when there are little undertones of maybe I don't love you in there, and then another something that says, well, maybe I really do, but I'm not consciously aware of it yet. So those are the overtones and symphonic counterpoints that we try to develop as much as possible in any film. When we look at a film that doesn't have these things, we say that it's flat, that it has no deeper emotional dimensions to it.
Yes, and thank you for elaborating on that, Walter. You've worked on so many films, and the next question may be quote unquote tricky, as it can be hard to really evaluate that. But which film do you feel, Walter, best represents your work, your body of work, and which film may serve as a prime example, which you may encourage everybody to see?
Hard question to answer. Because every film, I give myself 100% to every film that I work on.
Yes.
Some films are more successful commercially than others. Some films are more successfully artistically than others. But at the time, I give everything that I have to it. Having said that, probably Apocalypse Now, because I was both the film editor and the sound designer on that film. And I wrote sections of the screenplay of that film. And it took 2 years of my life working on it. So that's probably one of the biggest films. And it developed 5.1 sound for the first time. Yes. So there were many breakthroughs in that film compared to what came earlier.
And Apocalypse Now, you won your first Academy Award for it. You had your first collaboration, and correct me if I'm wrong, with Francis Coppola on The Rain People in '69.
Yeah.
And then you started working on The Godfather and Godfather II and III, and also Apocalypse Now, and The Conversation also, which is a very important movie, also for me personally. And how would you describe Francis Coppola, the filmmaker, and how he, let's say, valued your input and your contribution to his movies?
He famously once said, the director of a film is the ringmaster of a circus that is inventing itself. And that's how I would describe him from my experience. And each of us who is the head of a department working on that film are like trapeze artists or clowns or tightrope walkers in this circus. And he gives us a great deal of freedom to do what we do, to perfect our act. And as a director, he occasionally nudges us in one direction or the other. And as a director, he does what he can to emphasize our strong points and minimize our weak points, which is what the ringmaster of a circus does. But the important thing there also is those last words, a circus that is inventing itself. So he's acknowledging the organic evolution of a film. For him, unlike somebody like Alfred Hitchcock, who said, the perfect film exists in my head already. It's just the tedious process of shooting it that I have to realize. Whereas Francis, the process of shooting, although it can be agonizing, is also the process by which the film itself creates itself through the interaction of all of these various disciplines.
What are some of your personal do's and don'ts? Which is to be avoided at all costs, and which do you really need to fight for and adhere to in order to make it a better film?
Anything goes, depending on what the ultimate venue of the film is going to be. A film that appears as a short film, as an advertisement in a department store, has completely different criteria than a feature film that is going to be seen in a theater with an audience. And that in turn is different than a film that's only going to be seen as a streaming film in the home. You have to determine as an artist, as an editor working with the director, what approach you're going to take for these things. Having said that, I would advise the editor not to, when you're trying to decide where to cut a shot. So a shot is running along, where are you going to cut? In fact, the shot is being cut 25 times a second, 24 times in the United States. Each one of those is a cut, and you have to make a decision, each of those, to cut or not cut. So ultimately, as you're watching it, you're going, no, 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 yes. How do you determine the yes that I'm going to cut at this point? What I would avoid doing is what's called scrubbing across the image to determine the cut point. So what that means is using a joystick or the mouse or the pad, whatever, of moving back and forth in slow motion across the image to determine that is the frame where, for instance, the door is closed. Okay, and you decide that's the cut point. The audience will never experience that shot in slow motion. They're going to see it at 25 frames a second. So ultimately, you have to make that decision at 25 frames a second. So watch the shot, internalize the rhythms of that shot. It's like a visual music. And try to anticipate what the thoughts of the audience are as you watch the shot. And then, just like a musical instrument, decide where you are going to cut. Where are you going to cut to the next shot? And you will hit a button or the space bar or whatever it is. At that point, look at the time code that you happen to be at, and then to double check yourself, rewind and run the shot again and feel that same sense of thinking and feeling, and then hit the space bar. Now look at the time code. If you've hit exactly the same frame 2 times in a row, that's a good indication that that's a good place to cut, because it's impossible to do that in any other way than by responding musically to the events in the shot.
I would like to briefly talk about music, actually, because I've heard several times that some editors find it essential to cut or to use music when they assemble their first cut. Do you need music to make the first assembly? Do you try to avoid that?
I always avoid it. Yeah, in fact, when I'm assembling a scene for the first time, I turn off the sound completely. So
Okay.
I'm only responding to the images, even if it's a dialogue scene. I can lip read, and I have seen those shots with sound, but when I'm assembling it, I just pay attention to subtleties of expression and body language. I will look at it without sound, and then I will make changes again without sound, and only then will I turn on the tracks and listen to the sound that I have been cutting, but have not been listening to. And then I sometimes am very surprised at accidental things that I never would have done deliberately. And I preserve those, and then I fix whatever doesn't work. And then I move on from that. And so I do the same thing with music, that I think the relationship with music and image is very intimate. They're kind of like yin yang aspects of each other. The images in the scene have to be mature on their own terms before you can bring in music. And if you've been consistent well thinking about the images you put together, you will find almost automatically that music will go with those images. When I teach this at film schools, I say it's your duty to expect miracles. How did the music line up so exactly with the image, even if you didn't cut to music? Well, it's because of this yin-yang relationship between music and film.
Great. And if I am informed correctly, you also try to avoid visiting the set so you don't have a preconceived idea and you try to focus on the footage as it comes in. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's what an audience will see. And the film editor is one of the few people who is intimately involved with the creation of the film, who has the opportunity not to be present during the shooting. Obviously, the producer and the director and the cameraman and the costumer and the production designer and all of them are there while it's being shot. And when they see a scene, they can remember what temperature it was, what the set smelled like, who just had a big argument with somebody else, all of these kinds of things. And the audience is completely ignorant of these things. And so as a first audience, as an editor, I try to, as much as possible, insulate myself from all of that knowledge. And sometimes I have to go to the set to discuss something with the director, but I go onto the set and I don't look at the set. I wander around until I find the director's shoes, and then I just talk to the director, and then I close my eyes and leave. So I try to do everything I can not to absorb the atmosphere of the set.
Great. Thank you, Walter. In my opinion, some films, and it's just my opinion, tend to have a really fast edit. I think it's about pacing, rhythm, timing, and also about the logic behind the storytelling process. Would you agree?
Yes, you and I are in 100% agreement. The average rate of blinking of a human being is 12 blinks a minute, and that is the average rate of cutting in most motion pictures. When you can cut much faster than that for brief periods of time, but if you exceed that time, eventually the audience just it's like not understanding the dialogue. Eventually the audience just kind of gives up on a certain level with the film. And again, it's the editor's job is to anticipate what the audience is thinking and feeling, and to try to anticipate what they want without them knowing exactly what it is that they want, and then you give it to them by provoking them. So yeah, it's down to rhythm. Again, there are many analogies with music. If you play a symphony at too fast a metronomic rate, it just sounds like a ball of noise. You can't appreciate all of the subtleties of the interacting instruments and melodies and counter melodies. So it's the same thing with film.
Yes. And I think oftentimes it is expected in today's environment to deliver just that, fast-paced movie, because I think the audience will believe, this is so cool, but eventually it takes me out of the movie. I cannot enjoy the movie if the edits are too fast, or if there's the shaky cam and so on. So I think in my opinion, in today's cinema, lots of great features and let's say characteristics of great cinema have been lost to an extent.
The difference with the situation 50 years ago is that there is all kinds of cinema today. There's the cinema of advertising. There's the cinema of the videos that are trying to sell you certain clothes at a department store. There's the video that is trying to sell you something as you're putting gasoline into your car. And each of those venues requires a different approach. The department store knows that you are presented visually with a very complex environment at the store. And so the screen has to do things very aggressively to attract your attention, namely cutting very quickly and having lots of shaky cam. And that aesthetic is now part of the cultural environment that we live in, that what I call the flapping bird technique. And in a department store, it has a function, which is to get you to look at that screen. Necessarily, some of that aesthetic has migrated into cinema itself, which is a very different environment. There, at least in the theater, it's dark. The only thing that is illuminated is the screen itself. Yeah. And so there are no visual distractions. So the flapping bird technique has a very different aspect to it than it would in a chaotic visual environment of a department store.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Walter. And I would like to briefly talk about one of your collaborators, Anthony Minghella, who sadly passed away in 2008, if I remember correctly. You've worked with him on pictures such as The English Patient, The Talented Mr. Ripley, and also Cold Mountain. And you actually won 2 Oscars for The English Patient, for Best Editing and for Best Sound. So that's a huge achievement. And I would like to talk about his sensitivities and sensibilities as a filmmaker and what he brought to the table, which you found especially inspiring, so you could get into the nitty-gritty of the film.
Anthony, in some respects, is very much like Francis. They're both Italian, and so maybe there's that Italian sensibility of collaboration that runs through both of them. And he definitely invited the participation of all of the people working on the film to help the film evolve. And specifically regarding music, he invited Gabriel Jarhead to start already writing music before the film was even shot, so that the music, the themes could evolve and inform how the shooting happened and also how the editing proceeded. But it applied to everybody: camera, production design, editing, sound, costume, etc.
Most of today's films, or maybe even all, are edited digitally. You have used 4 different systems in order to edit a film. Could you elaborate on some of your techniques and the tools you used throughout your career?
Yes, actually, I think it's 5 systems. I started editing on the Moviola, and then I switched to the Chem horizontal table, and then I switched to Avid, then I switched to Apple Final Cut, and then lately I've been using Adobe Premiere. And ultimately, you are trying to tell a story with images and sound. So I don't think that the method by which you cut a film overly influences how you cut, especially if you're operating at a fairly high level. I remastered The Conversation 20 years ago, and I was interested because I edited the film 50 years ago using a Chem, and I thought, well, this is a good opportunity to see what changes have happened. And I was remastering it using the Avid and Pro Tools, and there was nothing I would have changed. I might have expected to think, oh yes, now I can tell that this was edited using film and real mechanical splicers and everything, but I couldn't tell the difference. So I don't think it's that different. It's kind of like the situation with cars over the last 50 or 60, 70 years. In the old days, if you drove an Opel and then you tried to drive a Cadillac, you would have to learn all different kinds of systems. Now, almost all cars have the same operating system in terms of where is the brake, where is the steering wheel, where is the accelerator. Nobody has a clutch anymore. These kind of decisions.
I would also recommend that anybody who is interested in editing also read your book, which is still available, and it's called in the blink of an eye. And I certainly need to read it again because I'm always interested in stories about the filmmaking process and collaborations with studios and directors. And
Yeah.
what do you think, Walter, was the most difficult getting it right process for you, either in terms of input from the director or the standard you set for yourself? What comes to mind?
Probably The Conversation, because it
Mhm.
was the first feature film that I ever edited. And Francis stopped shooting the film with 30% of the screenplay not filmed. He broke off filming because he had to go and do Godfather Part II. So, and then Francis basically was not present during the editing because he was making Godfather 2. And so the challenges of this being the first film to edit on a feature
Mhm.
and the fact that 30% of the scenes were not shot, how to solve that particular problem was probably the most intense.
Needless to say, you have worked on so many historic movies, The Godfather, and it's just, I mean, looking back, you must feel awfully proud and rightfully so. And I must also point out that you have a great variety in your career. I mean, we're not just talking about, The Godfather and Apocalypse Now. We're talking about films such as Romeo Is Bleeding, for instance, or Ghost, or The First Night. So it must be, I think, so very fulfilling to know that you have made such a large contribution to the world of cinema, if I may say
Yes,
so.
yeah, thank you. I'm glad you mentioned Romeo Is Bleeding, which was,
Yeah.
a particularly interesting. I was called in to help solve the problem of that film. So I wasn't the editor all the way
Mhm.
through. But it's a very intriguing film directed by Peter Medak.
Yes, it is a very intriguing film filled with or full of great performances. Not Gary Oldman, for instance. I
Yeah,
think one of the finest actors out there.
yeah, yeah. Gary Oldman and Lena Olin, also a
Yes,
fantastic performance by her. That
yes.
was one of the things that I contributed to it, is that she was, as when the film was shot, she was playing an Italian mobster, and her name was DeMarco.
Mhm.
And I said, when I looked at the film, I said, she was trying to do an Italian accent, but she couldn't do it. She's Swedish, and English is not her first language. It sounds more like Russian, so let's make her a Russian mobster. And so she became Demarkova. One of the things that an editor can bring to a film are those kinds of changes. It's easier in a sense sometimes to flip something 180
Mhm.
degrees than it is to make it change 50 degrees. You can change something 5 degrees
Mhm.
more or less.
Yeah.
That's fairly easy. Or you can flip something 180 degrees and make it the opposite of what it was. But to
Yeah.
make something change 50 degrees is usually the most difficult thing.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point, Walter. And did it ever happen throughout your career that you basically finished the edits and the director or producer or studio executive said, "Well, I think it's fine, but we need to go into a different direction," and you had to kind of shuffle again and to, I mean, not going back to the drawing board, but to make substantial changes?
Well, yes, the last fictional film I edited was Brad Bird's Tomorrowland,
Yes.
and the studio fired me from that because they were unhappy with the film, and they hired another editor who came in and finished the last 3 months of the editing. So I did. My name is on the film, but I did not finish the film.
If we still have a few minutes left, I would like to ask you about upcoming projects. What can you tell me about projects you have mapped out?
I'm in the middle of writing the book that I was talking about, so that's mainly what I'm doing at the moment. I'm working on a series of episodes with the South African artist William Kentridge. And we're almost finished with that. This is about the creative process in an artist's studio. I finished the film Coup 53, which is about the CIA and MI6 coup against the democratic government of Iran in 1953. That is still looking for a distributor. So those are the three things that I'm most involved with at the moment.
Okay, great. Have you ever considered directing again? I know you have directed The Return to Oz, but the film sadly wasn't very successful. Have you ever considered giving it another go?
Yeah, I tried for a number of years after that film to get directing projects off the ground, but probably, I mean, I was happy with the film, and it has a cult following now, but at the time it was not financially successful. And, none of the projects that I was interested in wanted to be picked up by the studio. So I went back to editing.
Walter, is there anything else you would like to add about your career? Anything else I might have forgotten or not covered? Anything that comes to mind?
No, you've been very thorough. Thank you.
I know we are basically out of time. I would like to thank you so very much for taking the time out of your schedule. I really loved the conversation. I hope you enjoyed it too.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Stay safe, stay healthy. I'm looking forward to your future projects. Thank you, Walter. Goodbye.